There are truths that will never see the light of history books, because if they did, the scaffolding of power itself would crack. Newport, Rhode Island. March 15th, 1889. Inside the grand halls of the Belmont Hotel, the air was heavy with the scent of velvet curtains, fresh polish on marble floors, and something else, something that didn't belong. Room 237 was still locked from the inside. Champagne glasses from a private gathering the night before sat untouched. A half-written letter lay abandoned on the desk, its ink still wet, but bearing no signature. And in the corner, draped over a chair like a discarded crown, was a silk evening gown worth more than most men's yearly wage. Isabella Fairmont was gone. No witnesses, no struggle, no trace except for the faint perfume she favored, a French blend called Cœur Noir, the Black Heart. The woman who had dined with presidents and whispered secrets to princes, the woman whose signature could bend the will of an entire social season, had vanished into the fog. And the truth of her disappearance was so corrosive, so dangerous, that 3 of America's most powerful families paid a fortune to have the police records sealed forever. But this is where you and I part ways with the safe version of the story. Because what you're about to hear isn't the Newport bedtime tale told in hushed tones over brandy. This is the raw truth, the one the elite have tried to burn out of existence. They will tell you Isabella was simply a socialite, a victim of romance gone wrong. Nuns. That she lost herself in scandal was swallowed whole by her own recklessness. But I will tell you something different. I will tell you that her fall was no accident. It was engineered. She was targeted, used, and when her knowledge became too dangerous, erased. And if you think that's something that could only happen in 1889, I need you to listen carefully, because the machinery that took her is still running today. You live inside it. By the time we're done, you'll see that what happened to Isabella Fairmont wasn't just a disappearance, it was a ritual. To understand why Isabella's disappearance shook the foundations of power, we have to go back 8 years, to the height of Newport's Gilded Age, when the air on Bellevue Avenue was heavy with cigar smoke, champagne foam, and the quiet arrogance of untouchable wealth. It was 1881, and Newport society was an elaborate machine, a closed system built on bloodlines, monopolies, and unspoken alliances between men who could bankrupt an entire town with a single telegram. Their mansions rose like fortresses along the coast, each one a monument to power disguised as leisure. Italian marble floors so cold they made the air shiver. Ballrooms lit by gas chandeliers imported from Paris. Gardens that swallowed the labor of 20 men just to keep their hedges perfect. It was here that Isabella Fairmont reigned. She had been born Isabella Catherine Aldridge in 1859, the perfect synthesis of old New England blood and new industrial fortune. Her father, Cornelius Aldridge, commanded a shipping empire that moved more than goods. Ships carry whispers, letters, private arrangements, and her mother's lineage traced straight back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a bloodline that opened doors no money could buy. From the moment she stepped into Newport society, she wasn't just accepted. She was installed, placed at the very center of its gravitational pull. With raven black hair, icy blue eyes, and a figure tailored for French couture, she became both an ornament and a strategist. In 1878, she married Theodore Fairmont, heir to a Pennsylvania steel fortune. Their wedding wasn't just a union, it was a merger, the kind that secured monopolies, bought senators, and decided whose sons would inherit which rail lines. Rosecliff Manor, their so-called A Summer Cottage, contained 70 rooms, each one carefully curated to display both refinement and dominance. And the gardens were laid out like a chessboard, a subtle message that every visitor was a piece on Isabella's table. Her parties weren't just gatherings, they were campaigns. Over champagne and caviar, senators traded favors. Railroad executives whispered mergers. Foreign dignitaries took her counsel on American temperament. Even President Chester Arthur had dined at her table. But in Newport's glittering world, influence came at a price. Beneath the crystal chandeliers and polite applause, there was a constant hum of surveillance, a silent ledger kept by those who measured power in secrets. You could climb to the highest rung in society, but only so long as you remembered that the ladder was never yours to own. And Isabella, for all her beauty and cunning, was about to forget that rule. The first shadow over Isabella's reign crept in quietly, like fog rolling in from the Atlantic. It was the summer of 1884. later remembered in the gossip columns as the season of shadows. It began, as these things often do, with a single sighting. Isabella, dining alone at the Newport casino, was seen in the company of Jonathan Pembroke, a young architect whose presence in Newport seemed almost too deliberate. Tall, lean, with dark hair that refused to stay in place, and eyes the shade of green that make you think of storms. Pembroke had been brought in to design elaborate additions to the mansions of Newport's elite. But his portfolio wasn't what turned heads. It was his aura. He moved through drawing rooms like he'd been there 100 times before, though no one could place exactly where he came from. His past was a blank canvas, and people in Newport are always eager to paint on a blank canvas. Whispers said he had worked for steel barons in Pittsburgh, restored colonial estates in Virginia, but every story about him had the same gap. A missing year here, an untraceable commission there. Isabella first met him at a committee meeting for the expansion of Trinity Church. Witnesses described it like a scene from a novel. Her reviewing plans by lamplight, Pembroke stepping into the room, their eyes locking across the table. What began as professional consultation dissolved quickly into something more dangerous. Pembroke began visiting Rosecliff under the pretense of discussing renovations, but he and Isabella would vanish for hours, strolling through her gardens, disappearing into her private study, their voices hushed, their laughter breaking the rigid silence of the manor. The staff, bound by the unspoken laws of discretion, still noticed. They always do. Theodore Fairmont, buried in the empire of steel and blind in the way powerful men often are to their own households, saw only architect's skill and his wife's enthusiasm for the renovations. That blindness would become his deepest regret. But Newport was no place for secrets. The same network that could protect your reputation could dismantle it with surgical precision. By August, the whispers had thickened into murmurs. By September, those murmurs became certainty. The Queen of Newport was in love with a man who was not her husband, and the machine that had crowned her had just begun to sharpen its knives. The kill strike came on the morning of October 12, 1884. New York Herald. Front page. Headline in letters big enough to be read from across a train station, Newport's fallen angel. The article was signed by a society columnist who hid behind the pen name Observer, a man whose words were weapons, whose information came from places only money and betrayal could reach. It wasn't gossip. It was a dossier, a surgical strike disguised as a column laying out Isabella's relationship with Jonathan Pembroke in such precise, intimate detail that the reader could almost smell the perfume on her letters. Witnesses placing them together at the casino. Anonymous sources describing embraces stolen in the conservatory of a Vanderbilt dinner party. And beneath all that, a far sharper blade. The Observer claimed Pembroke wasn't just an architect seeking an affair with a bored socialite. He was a man drowning in gambling debts, a man with a history of entangling himself with wealthy women in other cities, extracting fortunes from them under the guise of romance. The article named figures, sums of money transferred from Isabella's personal accounts, valuable pieces of the Fairmont art collection quietly sold to cover his losses. It was a perfect trap. The accusations were laced with just enough truth to make denial impossible, and just enough speculation to destroy her completely. When Theodore Fairmont read it, the impact was physical. This wasn't only an affair. This was betrayal laced with financial treachery, and the worst part, everyone knew before he did. His business partners, his friends, even the household staff. That night, the library at Rosecliff became a war room. Theodore confronted Isabella with bank ledgers and evidence of the sales. At first she denied it. Then, with the weight of the paper between them, she admitted to everything, but not with shame. She told him she loved Pembroke, that she had given him money out of devotion, not deception. Not deception. Theodore gave her the only terms he thought could salvage their standing. End the relationship, retreat to Boston for the winter, submit to a year of silence. Her answer was immediate, almost cold. She would not give Pembroke up. She would seek a divorce. It was more than defiance. In Newport's gilded world, it was treason, and treason is never forgiven. By November, the scandal had curdled into something far more dangerous than gossip. It had become a financial contagion. Theodore Fairmont, humiliated and furious, did what powerful men in his position always do. He began to erase her. The first step was surgical. Access to her personal accounts was cut off. Letters to her friends were intercepted. Servants loyal to her were dismissed without notice. And then came the more public strikes. A quiet phone call to the Union Club ensured that her name was removed from every guest list in Newport and New York. Her portrait, which had hung in the Newport Casino's grand dining hall, was quietly taken down. Invitations stopped arriving. Even women who had once sworn eternal friendship crossed the street to avoid her. And yet, Isabella didn't retreat. She and Jonathan Pembroke moved like a pair of gamblers doubling down on a losing hand. They dined at the most visible restaurants, appeared together on the promenades, and were seen attending the opera in New York, her hand looped through his arm, as if daring the world to speak. Behind the scenes, Theodore was digging. He hired detectives from the Pinkerton agency, men who could turn a rumor into a noose. They began to untangle Pembroke's past with brutal efficiency. What they found was worse than even Observer had hinted, a trail of unpaid debts across 4 states. Lawsuits quietly settled by women who had once been his patrons. An unexplained death of a widow in Baltimore whose estate had been gutted before her body was even buried. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Pembroke was no wandering genius of architecture. He was a predator who had perfected the art of seducing wealthy women, draining them, and vanishing before the ruin reached his name. But Theodore's investigation came too late to save more than his own pride. By December, Isabella had liquidated what remained of her personal jewelry, sold several pieces of family silver, and, in the most unforgivable blow, mortgaged a section of Rosecliff's land to fund one of Pembroke's projects. It was the kind of move that told Newport she was beyond redemption. A woman might recover from scandal, but from scandal and financial recklessness, never. And as the winter winds howled through the empty halls of Rosecliff, the city began to whisper a new, darker question. Not what Isabella had done, but what she might do next. The first real sign of danger came in January of 1885, during one of Newport's bitterest winters. Snow lay in drifts against the iron gates of Rosecliff, and the ocean beyond the cliffs was a roiling grey mass, restless, violent, and cold. Isabella had grown thinner. The brilliant silks and velvet she once wore now looked too heavy for her frame. But her eyes, those impossible ocean-colored eyes, burned hotter than ever. She spoke often of leaving, of starting over in Europe with Jonathan Pembroke, where society's claws could not reach them. But there was something new in her voice, something brittle. It began with small disturbances. Anonymous letters slipped under her door, their handwriting careful and deliberate. Some contained Bible verses about sin and ruin. Others were far less subtle, crude sketches, obscenities, even threats. At first, she laughed them off, telling Pembroke they were the shrieks of jealous women. But the tone shifted when she found one tacked to the stable door in the dead of night, the ink still wet, reading only, "He will leave you like the rest." Then came the man in the dark coat. None in the dark. Several servants swore they'd seen him standing at the edge of the property after dusk, just beyond the gaslights, smoking and watching the house. He never approached, never spoke, just lingered until the cold or the tide drove him away. Pembroke dismissed it all as Theodore's petty intimidation tactics, meant to frighten her back into submission. But the Pinkertons were still on his trail, and Isabella knew it. She began waking in the night to the sound of creaking floorboards, convinced someone had entered the house. The turning point came on a night when Pembroke failed to return from New York. A carriage arrived at Rosecliff in the early hours, but instead of Jonathan, it carried only a small wooden box. Inside was a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, pinned to a folded sheet of paper. In blocky, childlike letters it read, "The Queen always falls." Isabella locked her doors that night and kept a revolver on her bedside table. She didn't yet know if the threat came from Theodore's men, from one of Pembroke's many enemies, or from Pembroke himself. But deep down she sensed the truth. Danger was no longer circling her life, it was inside it. It happened in the space of a single dinner. February 1885, a storm tearing across the Atlantic, the wind rattling the shutters of the small townhouse Isabella had taken in New York. Jonathan Pembroke arrived late, his overcoat soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. She expected him to kiss her cheek, to pour a glass of wine, to bring the warmth he always carried like a weapon against the cold. Instead, he strode straight to the liquor cabinet, poured himself 3 fingers of brandy, and drained it in one swallow. She noticed it at once. a tension in him that wasn't about the weather. His hands trembled when he set down the glass. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He didn't answer at first, just stared into the fire. Then, without looking at her, he said, "We may need to leave the country sooner than we thought." Her heart dropped. What happened? Jonathan finally turned to her, and in the flicker of the firelight, his face looked sharper, crueler, as though some hidden part of him had surfaced. He told her, in clipped, almost casual words, that he had been confronted outside the Union Club by two men who knew his name, his debts, and his history in Baltimore. They had not threatened him outright, but the message was clear. They would collect what they were owed, in money or in blood. Isabella tried to comfort him, but he brushed her off. Then he said something that would echo in her mind for weeks afterward. "You think Theodore is the only man in this city who can ruin a life. You have no idea what kind of men I've dealt with." That night, she saw his mask slip further. Over dinner, he spoke of opportunities in Havana, men who could invest in his new projects if they were paid in advance. He pressed her for the deed to another small property she still controlled, insisting it was the last obstacle to their freedom. And when she hesitated just for a moment, his eyes went cold. It was then she understood. Jonathan Pembroke's charm was not a shield. It was a trap. And she was no longer a partner in some grand romantic escape. She was a resource to be drained, just like all the women before her. The storm outside howled, but inside for the first time, Isabella felt the full chill of the man she had chosen. The shift in Isabella was subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know her well. She still smiled in public, still draped herself on Pembroke's arm at the opera, still let him play the part of her dashing protector. But behind those smiles, something sharpened. She began taking solitary walks in the late afternoon, claiming she needed the air. Sometimes she would linger in bookshops. Other times she would disappear into narrow streets where Pembroke wouldn't think to follow. On one of those walks, she entered the offices of an attorney, an old friend of her father's who had known her since she was a child. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed, not from the cold, but from the first rush of control she had felt in months. What she did not tell Jonathan was that she had begun the slow, careful process of separating what little remained of her fortune from his reach. The land mortgage she had signed was irreversible, but the attorney assured her there were ways to protect other holdings, ways that required secrecy and absolute patience. The problem was that Jonathan Pembroke was not a patient man. In early March, he began pressing harder. There were arguments now, whispered at first, then sharp enough for the neighbors to overhear through thin townhouse walls. He accused her of not trusting him, of letting Theodore poison her mind. She accused him of gambling away the very money he demanded from her. And yet, despite the tension, Isabella didn't dare sever ties. Not yet. Pembroke's connections, whoever they truly were, frightened her more than she wanted to admit. The men who had approached him outside the Union Club were still out there, and she feared that if he fell, they might come for her as well. One night she woke to the sound of him rifling through her desk. He didn't notice her watching from the shadows. His movements were quick, practiced, and without hesitation. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he swore under his breath, poured himself another drink, and left the room. Isabella lay awake until dawn, a single truth crystallizing in her mind. She wasn't just living with a dangerous man. She was living with a man who knew she was preparing to escape him. It happened on a night that should have been uneventful, a small gathering at the home of a wealthy widow on Washington Square. Isabella wore black silk and pearls, her hair swept into a style Pembroke always admired. She had agreed to go only because it offered her a chance to speak quietly with a certain guest. A shipping magnate she believed could help her disappear to Europe under an assumed name. For the first hour, everything unfolded according to plan. The air was warm with lamplight and the smell of brandy. A pianist played in the corner while the city's elite murmured over cigars. Isabella had just drawn the magnate aside when the atmosphere shifted. Pembroke entered. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had told her he'd be dining with business associates at Delmonico's, but there he was in the doorway, scanning the room with eyes that found her in seconds. His smile was slow, deliberate, and wrong. He crossed to her without hurry, but with the quiet inevitability of a storm front. "Isabella," he said, taking her hand too tightly. "Introduce me to your friend." The magnate, sensing the current between them, offered a polite nod and excused himself. Pembroke waited until they were alone in the corner before leaning close enough for his breath to touch her ear. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" His voice was low, almost gentle, but threaded with steel. "You think you can make arrangements without me? Go ahead. But understand this, if you leave, you don't just vanish, you'll be found." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "And when you're found," he whispered, "it won't be me you have to worry about." Before she could respond, he released her, his smile snapping back into place as he turned to charm another guest. To the rest of the room, nothing unusual had occurred, but Isabella's pulse hammered in her ears. Later that night, as they rode home in silence, their carriage passed through a dimly lit stretch of Broadway. A stone, or something heavier, struck the side of the carriage with a crack. Pembroke flinched, muttered something under his breath, and ordered the driver to keep going. "Oh." She glanced back through the small rear window and, in the flicker of a gas lamp, saw a man in a dark coat watching them vanish into the night. 3 nights later, she saw him again. It was late, and Isabella had lingered in the parlor after Pembroke retired upstairs. The fire had burned low, throwing restless shadows on the walls. She was reading, or trying to, when the faintest sound reached her, not from the street, but from the alley that ran beside the townhouse. She rose, crossed the rug, and pulled the curtain just enough to peer out. There he was. The same man from Broadway, standing perfectly still beneath the lamplight, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. He wasn't looking at the window, not directly. Instead, his gaze seemed fixed on the front door, as if he were weighing whether to knock or break it down. Isabella's first instinct was to call for Pembroke, but something in the man's posture stopped her. Not menace exactly, but certainty. He was not a drunkard wandering the street, nor a petty thief. He was here for a purpose. She let the curtain fall. An hour later, when she went upstairs, Pembroke was awake, sitting in bed with a pistol across his lap. "Lock the doors," he said without looking at her, "and keep the shutters closed from now on." She asked why, but he only said, "It's nothing you need to trouble yourself with." Over the next week, the man in the dark coat appeared twice more. Once at the far end of the block, watching from the corner, once across the street, standing in the shadow of a doorway, always silent, always alone. And then, one rain-soaked evening in late March, Isabella returned from a visit to her attorney to find an envelope waiting on her desk. Ew. There was no name on it, no seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. "You are not safe with him." There was no signature. She read it twice, then a third time, her hands trembling. In her mind, questions spiraled. Who was this man? Was he a threat or a warning? And if he was telling the truth, how much time did she have before whatever danger he meant arrived at her door? The following morning, Isabella made a choice that weeks earlier she would have thought impossible. She did not show Pembroke the note. She did not even hint at having received it. Instead, she tucked it into the lining of her writing desk, beneath a false bottom her attorney had installed at her request, and went about her day as though nothing had changed. But something had. Every sound from the street seemed sharper now. Every unexpected knock at the door set her heart thudding, and Pembroke, though outwardly calm, was showing cracks. He paced more. Drank earlier in the day. His temper, once carefully leashed, began to slip in small, dangerous bursts. On the third night after the note arrived, she tested him. Over dinner, she asked casually, "Do you ever wonder if people are watching us?" The knife in his hand froze for half a second before resuming its movement. "People watch everyone worth noticing," he said. Then, almost too softly to hear, "and some people need watching more than others." His eyes lifted to hers. The air between them felt suddenly thinner. Later that evening, when he left to meet an associate, Isabella took her chance. She slipped into his study, a room he kept locked, but not well enough to stop her. Inside, the smell of cigars and stale whiskey hung heavy. Papers lay scattered on the desk. One folder caught her attention immediately, a sheaf of letters tied with black ribbon. They were written in the same precise hand as the note she had received, but these were addressed to Jonathan Pembroke. Her breath caught as she read the first line of the top letter. "You are behind schedule. She must be ready by April." There was no name, only the same elegant script and the same unshakable implication. She was at the center of something orchestrated, something she had not agreed to and could not yet see in full. A sound in the hallway snapped her out of it. She returned the letters exactly as she had found them, slipped out of the study, and was back in the parlor just as Pembroke returned. That night, she lay awake knowing two things with absolute certainty. The man in the dark coat was not her enemy, and April was closing in fast. It was the first truly warm evening of spring when Isabella finally met him. Pembroke had been called away suddenly, something about a shipment arriving early at the docks. He left without dinner, without even changing from his day clothes, which was unusual for him. Isabella waited until she was certain he was gone, then took her shawl and stepped out into the dusky air. The city was restless that night. Gas lamps glowed against the fading sky, their halos catching the damp in the air. She walked aimlessly at first, keeping to the quieter streets, her mind circling the black ribbon letters hidden in Pembroke's study. It was in a narrow lane near the river that she saw him again. The man in the dark coat. He was leaning against the wall of a shuttered bakery, as if he'd been expecting her. For a moment they simply stared at one another. Then he pushed off the wall and approached, his movements measured but without hesitation. "You shouldn't be walking alone," he said. His voice was low, steady, but carried a trace of urgency. "And you shouldn't be watching me," she replied, though the words lacked bite. "I watch you," he said, "because you're in danger." Isabella crossed her arms, not out of defiance, but to keep her hands from trembling. "You sent the note." "I did, and I meant it. And I meant it." He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street before stepping closer. Pembroke isn't who he says he is. He stopped himself, eyes narrowing. "It's not safe to tell you here." She hesitated, torn between instinct and fear. "Then tell me where." "There's a church on Mercer Street," he said. "St. Jude's, back entrance, just after midnight tomorrow. If you come, you'll hear the truth. But if you do," he paused, his gaze sharpening, "you won't be able to go back to the life you have now." And then, without another word, he walked away, disappearing into the gathering fog as if he'd never been there at all. Isabella stood frozen for several seconds before she realized her pulse was racing, not from fear, but from something else entirely, the faint, dangerous spark of hope. Tomorrow at midnight she would have to decide. The walk back from St. Jude's felt different, heavier, sharper, as if the city itself had shifted around her. By the time Isabella reached the townhouse, her mind was no longer a fog of fear, but a clear, cold map of choices. She could flee tonight, take what little was truly hers, and vanish. She would survive, but Pembroke or Harcourt, or whatever name he chose next, would simply find another woman. That thought settled like a stone in her chest. The next day she played her part flawlessly. She laughed at his jokes, asked about his business, even poured his drink just the way he liked. And when he left that evening for another meeting, she slipped into his study one last time. The black ribboned letters were waiting. She took them, everyone, along with the account ledgers that bore her forged signature, but she didn't stop there. She went to the locked drawer at the bottom of the desk, the one she had never dared open before. Inside was a leather-bound book, its pages filled with names, dates, and amounts, a meticulous record of every woman before her and the fortune he had stripped from each. By midnight, she was at the city magistrate's office. The man from St. Jude's was already there, his expression grim but resolute. Together, they laid the evidence out in a single, unbroken chain, enough to bring not just ruin, but a prison cell. Pembroke was taken at dawn. She didn't watch the arrest, but she heard the commotion from her bedroom, the pounding of boots on the steps, the sharp command for him to step outside. 3 weeks later, on the very day April had loomed like a noose, Isabella walked alone through the city market, the spring air alive with the scent of fresh blossoms. She felt no need to glance over her shoulder. The shadow that had followed her for months was gone. The man from St. Jude's passed her in the crowd, tipping his hat. He didn't stop, and she didn't call after him. Their work together was finished. Isabella turned toward the harbor, the sun rising at her back, her steps light for the first time in what felt like years. She was free, not because she had run, but because she had stood her ground and ended the story herself. And somewhere, in the hush between footsteps, she felt her sister's hand in hers. The walk back from St. Jude's felt different, heavier, sharper, as if the city itself had shifted around her. By the time Isabella reached the townhouse, her mind was no longer a fog of fear, but a clear, cold map of choices. She could flee tonight, take what little was truly hers, and vanish. She would survive, but Pembroke or Harcourt or whatever name he chose next, would simply find another woman. That thought settled like a stone in her chest. The next day, she played her part flawlessly. She laughed at his jokes, asked about his business, even poured his drink just the way he liked. And when he left that evening for another meeting, she slipped into his study one last time. The black ribbon letters were waiting. She took them, everyone, along with the account ledgers that bore her forged signature. But she didn't stop there. She went to the locked drawer at the bottom of the desk, the one she had never dared open before. Inside was a leather-bound book, its pages filled with names, dates, and amounts, a meticulous record of every woman before her, and the fortune he had stripped from each. By midnight, she was at the city magistrate's office. The man from St. Jude's was already there, his expression grim but resolute. Together, they laid the evidence out in a single, unbroken chain. Enough to bring not just ruin, but a prison cell. Pembroke was taken at dawn. She didn't watch the arrest, but she heard the commotion from her bedroom, the pounding of boots on the steps, the sharp command for him to step outside. 3 weeks later, on the very day April had loomed like a noose, Isabella walked alone through the city market, the spring air alive with the scent of fresh blossoms. She felt no need to glance over her shoulder. The shadow that had followed her for months was gone. The man from St. Jude's passed her in the crowd, tipping his hat. He didn't stop, and she didn't call after him. Their work together was finished. Isabella turned toward the harbor, the sun rising at her back, her steps light for the first time in what felt like years. She was free, not because she had run, but because she had stood her ground and ended the story herself. And somewhere, in the hush between footsteps, she felt her sister's hand in hers.